Well, we think about the era of the first two Godfather movies in the conversation. Have we created a myth about that period that's completely out of proportion with reality? Was it as great and as creative and interesting as we all believe it was?
I think it was a point in which the big studios came to the conclusion that they didn't know the kinds of films to make. You know, we had gone through big films like The Sound of Music had sort of tapered off, and they made other films in that design, and they weren't quite working, and so they were sort of they were all ears as to what these younger filmmakers wanted to do, and I think there were some inspirational breakthroughs. I think Bonnie and Clyde was one, which at first was received very negatively, and the studios didn't. The studio finance it didn't even care for it, and then people started to respond to some, Midnight Cowboy, I would think. So there began to be some interest in a more unusual type of film. But it was somewhat accidental, and it was primarily because I think we all talked a good game, and they didn't know what to do next. And maybe something like that might happen again, because if the big bet on Shrek and those kinds of films doesn't just go on for years and years, there's going to come a point where they're not going to know what to do next, and some persuasive filmmakers will get in there and maybe get a chance to.
But right now, a movie like Bonnie and Clyde or a movie like Midnight Cowboy probably would have a much harder time getting made.
Well, at those budgets, because the independent film business is just a different set of economics, and it's very hard to get, I mean, even what those movies cost, and they were considered more modest, I would think it would be very tough to get those going.
In going back and rereading about that period, I was reminded that you were not that interested in doing the first Godfather movie when.
No, not at all. We had moved to San Francisco. We had a company called American Zoetrope, and had all these colleagues, George Lucas and Carol Ballard and John Milius and many others, and we wanted to make, as always, personal films. And a personal film, I mean, you know what it is. We were inspired to think that way from the wonderful European films that we were seeing in the late 50s and the 60s, and we wanted to do that. Films that you write out of your life or feeling, and are made for the sort of, in the way novels had been before, or great plays, that whenever a playwright or a novelist was coming out with a new work, you were just so excited. What would it be? Have no idea what it would be, and it was like a breakthrough. And today, in this era of more marketing, even within publishing, there's less of that. I mean, maybe we wait for the new Dave Eggers novel, or Michael Chabon, or a few people, but mostly everything is about getting on the bestseller list or publishing the scores of the box office, and that excitement of an artist's next vision and his next phase is less what it's about. And certainly in the film business, I mean, you don't really rush to see a new film by even some of the great filmmakers that we have, because they have 2 or 3 in so-called development, and the one that gets the actors or the stars, the one that's going to get made. And when you go see the next Ridley Scott film, it's not going to give you some insight necessarily in a profound way about how he feels about life and our times. It's usually that these are products to make a lot of money.
But back to The Godfather, that was not something that when it was brought to you, you necessarily felt, I want to do this.
No, we were broke, and George Lucas would come to me and say, Francis, what are you going to do? Sheriff is going to chain up the door of Zoetrope, and we're not going to be able to get in anymore, and you've got to take. And I read The Godfather. When I read it, I thought of it as a big, like Irving Wallace. If you remember the original book, there was a lot more to it than just the story of the father. It was a preposterous subplot that took up a third of the book about Lucy Mancini and her anatomical problems, and the doctor who cured it and then used it, and it went on and on. So I just thought, oh my God, I don't want to do something like this. But finally I read it, realizing I needed a job. I had also 2 kids and another one on the way. And I started to look at it just more from the story of a father and 3 sons, more classically like a king with 3 sons, and more like a Shakespeare story. And that's sort of what I excised out of the book. But I didn't want to do it. No.
Did you imagine at the time, as you were making it or afterwards, that it would have the legs it does? Because honestly, you still have people today talk about The Godfather as one of the best films they've ever seen, as if it was just in theater.
Well, you know, ironically, and I think there's some reason for it, the whole time I was making the film, I was very, very much oppressed by the studio. I was always on the verge of getting fired. They didn't like what I was doing. They didn't like the look of the film. They didn't like the casting of the film. And I just thought I was totally washed up. And it was only way later after, and I had shown the film too among friends in San Francisco, theoretically very film savvy people, and no one said, oh wow, that's really something. I said, well, it's long or it's dark. And when, I remember when The French Connections came out, I was almost frightened to go see it. And I remember walking home with an assistant editor who was pushing his bicycle to walk with me, and I said, gee, well, you saw The French Connection? He says, yeah, it's fantastic. I said, well, I said to him, I guess after that, people are going to think The Godfather is just this long, boring, dark movie. And he said, yeah, I guess you're right. so it was pretty low. And
right. What didn't they like about the cast?
Originally?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the studio felt that this newcomer, Al Pacino, was just like, in their words, a short little runt. They thought Brando was clearly washed up, and you know, they just generally, I guess, it was just a different way to make a movie, and that's probably what made it have some life, is that it was not made in the way that they would make a gangster movie, and it had its own style and look. And, you know, I've learned in my life, as a young person, I wrote the script of Patton.
Right.
When I was pretty young, about 25, 26, and when I finished that script, they really took big exception with the beginning and argued with me about how can you have a beginning where this man walks up, a 4-star general with all these decorations, and just gives a speech to the audience, and then the next shot he's a 3-star general, and it's all just doesn't, people will be confused. And of course, the opening of Patton is considered a great opening today. So what I conclude, and what I even tell young people, is remember that the things that you're fired over when you're young are the same things that you're going to be celebrated for when you're older.
Right.
And there's a good reason for that,
right.
because if they break the mold, it's hard for people to grasp something that's a little different than what they're used to.
But is it easier today for a young filmmaker to take that stand than it was back then?
Well, it's so different now. Back then, when we went to film school in the early 60s, none of us thought we'd ever get to make motion pictures. We thought we were going to make industrial films or educational films. Now it's we know here in your own town, we know Robert Rodriguez made a film for $29,000, and the technology has become more accessible, and so we know plenty of young people are making feature films now, which is fabulous. But
maybe they're not as reliant on people to have to give them permission.
Yeah, they get their uncle's credit card or God knows what, but we know it's possible. In those days, it was a real barrier to think, because the directors of films, if you see the stills from the 40s, they're wearing suits and have a pipe, and very often they're it was a club, a very exclusive club. But even so, that young people now can make films, the problems confronting them of getting distribution, because there are so many of them, right. and distribution has always been the key. How do young people, you go to places and they desperately want to give you their DVD, and it used to be their script, now it's their DVD.
There may be a few of them here, actually.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Let me come back to The Godfather. So 2 years later, you make the first one, and then 2 years later, you make the second one. And I wonder what changed.
I didn't want to make the second one
right.
at all. I had such a miserable experience on the first one. The thought of being there doing it, and what I finally, after they really said, we'll do anything, please do it, I said I will agree to produce the second one and help a director do it, and I'll choose the director. And after some months went by, I came to them and said, okay, I'm ready, and I've chosen a director to do the second one, and they said, who? And I said, Martin Scorsese, and the same guys who didn't want Brando and Pacino said, absolutely not, that's ridiculous, and then the head of the company, who was Charlie Bluthorn, said to me, finally, Francis, okay, anything you want.